A girl was expelled from a plane in front of dozens of passengers, as if she were just another inconvenient child. No one there imagined that the little girl in tears was the daughter of the billionaire who founded the airline. Watch until the end to see this beautiful twist unfold. If this story touched you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you're watching from. We continue. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Continental Airways headquarters in Dallas, casting long shadows across the polished marble floors. 7-year-old Emily Harrison stood in the executive boardroom, her small hand clasped tightly in her grandmother's weathered palm. The room smelled of leather and coffee, and the adults around the massive oak table spoke in hushed, careful tones. Emily didn't fully understand the words they were using, words like estate, fiduciary, and succession, but she understood the weight of their gazes. They were looking at her differently now, not like a child, like something else entirely. Her father had been gone for 3 weeks. The funeral had been a blur of black suits and whispered condolences, of strangers touching her hair and telling her how brave she was. But Emily didn't feel brave. She felt small and lost in a world that had suddenly grown too large. Her father, Robert Harrison, had built Continental Airways from a single regional route into one of the most respected carriers in North America. He had been larger than life, a man who could command a boardroom with the same ease he commanded the skies. And now he was gone, and somehow, impossibly, his empire had fallen into her tiny hands. The lawyer, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses named Mr. Peterson, cleared his throat. He explained, in words simplified for her benefit, that her father's will had been very specific. Emily was the sole heir. The company, the assets, everything belonged to her. Of course, she couldn't run it herself, not yet. A board of trustees had been appointed, experienced executives who would guide the company until she came of age. But the ownership, the symbolic heart of Continental Airways, that was hers. Emily's grandmother squeezed her hand. Margaret Harrison was a formidable woman, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, who had supported her son's dreams even when they seemed impossible. Now she would support her granddaughter. She leaned down and whispered, "Your daddy wanted you to know this world, sweetheart. He wanted you to understand what he built and why it mattered. You don't have to do anything right now except watch and learn." And so Emily began to watch. At first, the executives treated her like a mascot, a sweet distraction from the serious business of running an airline. They would smile indulgently when she appeared in the hallways, her school backpack bouncing against her shoulders, her sneakers squeaking on the polished floors. But Emily was not content to be a mascot. She was curious, intensely so, with the kind of focused attention that made adults uncomfortable. She would sit in the corner of conference rooms, supposedly doing homework, but her ears were always tuned to the discussions around her. She asked questions that were too perceptive for a child her age. Why did fuel costs fluctuate so much? Why did some routes lose money while others thrived? Why did passengers complain about certain airports but not others? The interim president, a veteran pilot named Captain James Mitchell, was the first to take her seriously. He had flown with her father in the early days, when Continental was just a dream and a handful of leased planes. He saw something of Robert in Emily, that same relentless curiosity, that same refusal to accept easy answers. He started bringing her along on inspections, letting her sit in jump seats during test flights, explaining the mechanics of aviation in terms she could understand. Emily soaked it all in like a sponge. By the time she was 9, Emily had become a fixture at company events. She stood beside Captain Mitchell at the anniversary celebration, her small frame dwarfed by the podium, and delivered a speech that brought tears to the eyes of veteran employees. She spoke about her father's vision, about the importance of treating every passenger with dignity, about how flying wasn't just about getting from point A to point B, but about connecting people to their dreams. The media loved her. Headlines called her the youngest CEO in America, though of course she held no such title. She was a symbol, a living embodiment of her father's legacy, and Continental Airways embraced that symbolism with fierce pride. At 10, Emily proposed the creation of a junior advisory committee, a group of children whose parents worked for or flew with Continental. She wanted to hear their ideas, their complaints, their dreams. The board approved it more as a public relations gesture than anything else, but Emily took it seriously. She met with the children monthly, listened to their suggestions, and presented the best ideas to the executive team. Some were implemented: a family-friendly lounge at the Dallas hub, coloring books and activity kits on long-haul flights. Small changes, but they mattered. By 11, Emily had her own employee badge, her photo laminated beside her name, and the title Special Advisor. She attended board meetings, not as a voting member but as an observer, and her presence changed the tone of those gatherings. Executives found themselves explaining their decisions in simpler, more honest terms, as if her youthful gaze demanded transparency. She was given the honor of naming new aircraft, a tradition her father had cherished. She chose names like Hope, Unity, and Courage, names that reflected her belief in what aviation could represent. But not everyone was pleased with Emily's growing influence. Richard Caldwell had been Robert Harrison's right-hand man for over a decade, a shrewd executive with a talent for navigating corporate politics. He had expected, perhaps even assumed, that he would take control of Continental after Robert's passing. Instead, he found himself sidelined, forced to defer to a child and her circle of appointed guardians. Richard was too smart to voice his resentment openly, but it simmered beneath his polished exterior. He began to plant seeds of doubt among investors and board members. Was it really wise to let a child, no matter how precocious, have such a visible role in company decisions? What message did it send to shareholders, to competitors? Richard framed his concerns in terms of fiduciary responsibility, but his true motivation was simpler. He wanted control, and Emily stood in his way. As Emily entered her early teens, the airline industry grew more competitive. A new low-cost carrier, Sky Budget Airlines, began aggressively undercutting Continental's prices on key routes. The board debated how to respond. Some argued for matching prices, others for emphasizing Continental's superior service. Emily, now 13 and increasingly confident in her voice, suggested a different approach. She proposed investing in operational bases, particularly in underserved markets, and doubling down on customer service training. If Continental couldn't compete on price alone, it could compete on experience. The board, with some reluctance, agreed. One of those operational bases was in Galveston, a coastal city in Texas, with a small but busy regional airport. It was supposed to be a model of Continental's renewed commitment to service. But reports began to filter back to headquarters that something was wrong. Passenger complaints were unusually high. Flight attendants reported a hostile work environment. And at the center of it all was a senior pilot, Captain Derek Lawson. Captain Lawson was a former military aviator with an impressive flight record, but a troubling history of interpersonal conflicts. He had been hired during a period of rapid expansion, and his connections to the regional manager, Tom Brennan, had shielded him from scrutiny. Tom and Derek had served together in the Air Force, and their friendship ran deep. Too deep, perhaps, for Tom to see Derek's flaws clearly. Emily, now 14 and deeply involved in reviewing operational reports, noticed inconsistencies in the Galveston data. Complaint rates were high, but incident reports were suspiciously low. It didn't add up. She brought her concerns to Captain Mitchell, who quietly authorized an internal audit. What they found was disturbing. Captain Lawson had a pattern of aggressive behavior toward passengers and crew. There were whispers of drinking, though nothing had been officially documented. Tom Brennan had been covering for him, burying complaints, reassigning crew members who spoke up. Emily wanted to see the situation for herself. It was a risky idea, perhaps even reckless, but she was determined. With the discreet support of 2 trusted employees, she arranged to travel to Galveston under an assumed identity. She would use her mother's maiden name, Cooper, and dress like any other teenager traveling alone. 2 Continental employees, posing as ordinary passengers, would keep watch over her. It was supposed to be a simple fact-finding mission. Observe, report, return. The flight from Dallas to Galveston was scheduled for a Thursday afternoon. Emily boarded with a small backpack, wearing jeans and a hoodie, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She looked like any other kid traveling to visit family. She found her seat near the back of the plane and settled in, her heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. This was real. This was her company, her responsibility. and she was going to see the truth for herself. The flight attendants seemed distracted, their smiles forced. The pre-flight announcements were rushed, almost dismissive. Emily watched everything, noting the small failures of service. A passenger asked for a blanket and was told they were out, though Emily could see a stack of them in an overhead bin. A mother with a fussy toddler was met with irritation rather than empathy. These were small things, perhaps, but they added up to an experience that fell far short of Continental standards. Then Captain Lawson's voice crackled over the intercom. His tone was curt, almost hostile. He announced their departure with none of the warmth or professionalism Emily had come to expect from Continental pilots. There was an edge to his voice, something that made her uneasy. 20 minutes into the flight, turbulence hit. It was moderate, nothing. Unusual for the Gulf Coast, but the crew's reaction was panicked. Flight attendants rushed to their seats, their faces pale. One of them forgot to secure the beverage cart, and it rolled dangerously down the aisle before another attendant grabbed it. Passengers looked around nervously, feeding off the crew's anxiety. Emily gripped her armrest, not because she was afraid of the turbulence, but because she was afraid of what it revealed. This crew was not prepared. They were not trained to handle even routine challenges with calm professionalism. The landing in Galveston was rough, the plane hitting the runway hard, enough to jostle passengers in their seats. There was no apology from the cockpit, no reassurance, just a terse announcement that they had arrived and passengers should remain seated until the seatbelt sign was off. Emily felt a knot of anger tightening in her chest. This was not the Continental Airways her father had built. This was something else, something broken. She disembarked with the other passengers and made her way through the small terminal. Her plan was to observe the ground operations, maybe speak to a few employees and then catch a return flight that evening. But as she walked toward the Continental service desk, she noticed a man watching her. He was tall, with graying hair and a Continental uniform, Tom Brennan, the regional manager. Their eyes met for just a moment, and Emily saw recognition flicker across his face. Her stomach dropped. Someone had told him, someone had betrayed her cover. She turned quickly, trying to blend into the crowd, but it was too late. Within minutes, her identity was confirmed. Tom made a phone call, and Emily could only imagine what was being said. She boarded her return flight with a sense of dread, knowing that Captain Lawson would be at the controls. The plane filled with passengers, and Emily took her seat, trying to remain calm. The two employees who were supposed to be watching over her were seated several rows away, their expressions tense. They knew something was wrong too. The cabin doors closed and the plane began to taxi. Emily stared out the window, her mind racing. She just needed to get home. She just needed to get back to Dallas and report what she had seen. But then the plane stopped. The engines powered down and Captain Lawson emerged from the cockpit. His face was flushed, his eyes glassy. He walked down the aisle with unsteady steps and passengers turned to watch him with confusion and alarm. He stopped at Emily's row and pointed a finger at her, his voice loud and slurred. "You," he said, "you think you can spy on me? You think you can come here and judge me? I know who you are. You're that little girl who thinks she owns this airline. Well, you don't own me." Emily's heart hammered in her chest. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. Passengers were staring now, some pulling out their phones. Captain Lawson turned to the flight attendants and barked an order. "Get her off this plane. She's a security risk." The flight attendants hesitated, clearly confused, but Tom Brennan appeared at the cabin door, backing up the captain's command. Airport security was called. Two uniformed officers boarded the plane and approached Emily's seat. She tried to explain, her voice shaking. "I'm Emily Harrison. I own this airline. This is my company." But without her identification, without proof, she was just a frightened teenager making wild claims. The officers didn't believe her. They took her by the arms, gently but firmly, and led her off the plane. Her backpack fell from her lap, spilling books and a stuffed bear onto the floor. Passengers recorded everything, their phones capturing her tear-streaked face, her desperate protests. The plane door closed behind her, and moments later the engines roared to life. Continental Airways Flight 447 departed without her, leaving Emily Harrison standing alone in the Galveston terminal, humiliated and powerless. For over an hour, she sat in a small office, trying to convince airport staff of her identity. They were polite but skeptical. Finally, after frantic calls to Dallas, after documents were faxed and verified, the truth was confirmed. The airport manager's face went white. The security officers stammered apologies. But the damage was done. Emily had been removed from her own airline, treated like a threat, and the whole world was about to know. By the time she was escorted onto a private charter back to Dallas, the video had already gone viral. Millions of people watched a 14-year-old girl being dragged off a plane, crying and clutching her belongings, insisting she was the owner of the airline. The comments ranged from outrage to disbelief. Some called it corporate abuse. Others questioned whether a child should ever have been put in such a position. The story dominated news cycles, and Continental Airways found itself in the center of a public relations firestorm. Captain Derek Lawson was subjected to immediate testing upon landing. His blood alcohol level was above the legal limit for operating an aircraft. He was terminated within hours. Tom Brennan, implicated in covering up Lawson's behavior and authorizing Emily's removal, was also fired. Continental issued a public statement announcing sweeping reforms, including anonymous reporting systems, surprise inspections, and enhanced ethics training. But the damage to the company's reputation was severe, and the damage to Emily was even worse. Richard Caldwell saw his opportunity. He called emergency board meetings, arguing that the incident proved Emily's involvement in operations was a liability. He proposed restructuring the guardianship, removing Captain Mitchell and others who supported Emily's active role, and installing a new management team with himself at the helm. He framed it as protecting the company, protecting Emily herself from further harm. Some board members, shaken by the scandal, were inclined to agree. But Emily was not ready to be sidelined. She insisted on addressing the media herself. Against the advice of lawyers and publicists, she stood before a room full of reporters, her hands trembling but her voice steady. She told them the truth. She had gone to Galveston because she cared about the people who flew Continental, because she wanted to make sure her father's legacy was being honored. She admitted that she had made mistakes, that perhaps she had been too bold, too reckless. But she refused to apologize for caring. She refused to apologize for trying to do what was right. And then, with tears streaming down her face, she said something that would be quoted for years to come. "I don't want to be a symbol. I don't want to be a mascot or a headline. I just want to learn how to be the person my father believed I could be, someone who treats people with respect, someone who listens, someone who tries to make things better even when it's hard, even when it hurts." The room fell silent. Cameras flashed. And in that moment, public opinion began to shift. People saw not a corporate pawn or a spoiled heiress, but a young girl trying to navigate an impossible situation with grace and integrity. Social media rallied behind her. Passengers shared their own stories of poor treatment on airlines, of feeling invisible and unheard. Emily became a symbol after all, but not the one Richard Caldwell had hoped to exploit. She became a symbol of accountability, of the idea that companies should be held to higher standards, that every passenger deserved dignity. Continental's booking numbers, which had initially dipped after the scandal, began to climb. Investors who had wavered renewed their support, and Richard Caldwell's attempted coup collapsed before it could gain traction. But the most damaging blow to Richard came from an unexpected source. A longtime Continental employee, a man who had worked in the Galveston office and witnessed Tom Brennan's abuses firsthand, came forward with recordings, secret audio files that documented conversations between Tom and Derek. Conversations in which they mocked passengers, discussed hiding complaints, and even joked about intimidating employees who questioned their authority. The recordings were handed over to Emily's legal team and subsequently released to the press. The public was horrified, and Richard, who had been quietly supporting Tom's management style as efficient and results-oriented, found himself implicated by association. The board moved swiftly. Richard Caldwell was asked to resign. He left Continental quietly, his reputation in tatters, his ambitions crushed. Captain Mitchell was given expanded authority, and a new ethics oversight committee was established, with Emily as a non-voting advisory member. The company began the long process of rebuilding trust, both internally and with the public. But for Emily, the hardest revelation was still to come. During a routine review of company archives, she discovered something that shattered her idealized image of her father. There were files, old personnel records that showed Robert Harrison had been informed of Derek Lawson's problematic behavior years earlier. Multiple complaints had been filed, and Robert had reviewed them personally. But Derek had been a friend of Tom Brennan, and Tom had been instrumental in securing landing rights at several key airports. Robert had made a calculated decision to overlook Derek's issues in favor of maintaining a valuable business relationship. He had prioritized expansion over ethics, convenience over accountability. Emily sat alone in her father's old office, the files spread across his desk, and felt a grief deeper than anything she had experienced at his funeral. Her father had not been perfect. He had made mistakes, compromises that had real consequences for real people. The legacy she had been fighting so hard to protect was flawed, built on decisions that contradicted the very values she thought he stood for. For the first time, she questioned whether she was honoring her father or simply clinging to a myth. Her grandmother found her there hours later, staring out the window at the runways below. Margaret sat beside her and waited, letting the silence stretch until Emily was ready to speak. "He knew," Emily whispered. "He knew about Captain Lawson and he didn't do anything." Margaret nodded slowly. "Your father was a great man, sweetheart, but he was still just a man. He made mistakes, we all do." Emily turned to her, eyes red. "Then what am I supposed to do? How am I supposed to carry on his legacy if I don't even know what that legacy really is?" Margaret took her granddaughter's hand. "You don't carry on his legacy, Emily. You build your own. You take the good things he taught you, the love and the vision and the courage, and you leave behind the mistakes. You make Continental into what it should have been all along. That's not betraying your father. That's honoring him by being better than he was." Emily let those words sink in, and slowly, painfully, she began to understand. Her mission was not to preserve the past unchanged. It was to learn from it, to grow beyond it, to create something new and better. She was not her father's shadow. She was her own person with her own voice, her own values, her own vision for what Continental Airways could become. In the years that followed, Emily continued her education, both in classrooms and in boardrooms. She visited training centers, spoke with employees at every level, and listened to passengers with genuine empathy. She championed initiatives that prioritized people over profits, that treated every traveler as someone with a story, a dream, a destination that mattered. She made mistakes, faced setbacks, and learned from both. And slowly, Continental Airways transformed into something more than just an airline. It became a model for corporate responsibility, for ethical leadership, for the idea that business success and human dignity were not mutually exclusive. When Emily turned 18, she stood before the board of directors and accepted the title of President and CEO of Continental Airways. The weight of it settled on her shoulders in a way she had never felt before. This was no longer symbolic. Every decision would be hers to own. Captain Mitchell stepped down from his interim role with visible pride. The company was now fully in Emily's hands. Her first major decision as CEO was to expand Continental's commitment to employee welfare. She established a mental health program for all staff and increased wages for ground crew and flight attendants. Skeptical investors questioned the expense, but Emily argued that a well-compensated workforce would deliver better service. She was right. Within a year, employee satisfaction reached record highs, and passenger complaints dropped significantly. Emily also pushed for environmental initiatives, investing in fuel-efficient aircraft and sustainable aviation fuel partnerships. It was expensive and risky, but she believed it was right. She spoke passionately about Continental's responsibility to future generations. Her youth, once seen as a liability, became an asset. She represented a new generation of leadership that refused to choose between profit and responsibility. Through it all, Emily remained grounded by the people around her. Her grandmother Margaret offered wisdom. Captain Mitchell provided guidance. And then there was Daniel. Daniel Reeves was an architect specializing in airport design, a quiet man with a passion for creating welcoming spaces. Emily met him at an aviation infrastructure conference. He presented a terminal concept, incorporating natural light and green spaces, and Emily was captivated, not just by his ideas, but by his genuine belief that design could improve lives. They talked after his presentation, and the conversation stretched through dinner into the late evening. They discovered a shared philosophy that details mattered, that every interaction should be treated with care. Their relationship developed slowly, built on mutual respect. Daniel had no interest in the spotlight. He was content to support Emily from the background, to be her refuge from relentless demands. When he proposed, it was a quiet moment on the observation deck of Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport, watching planes take off into the sunset. He told her he loved her because of how she carried her responsibilities, with grace and determination. Emily said yes without hesitation. They married a year later, in a small ceremony with close friends and family. The birth of their daughter Sophie brought new purpose to Emily's life. Holding that tiny human in her arms, she felt fierce protectiveness. She wanted to build a world Sophie could be proud of, a company that stood for more than profits. She promised Sophie she would teach her everything, all the hard lessons, so Sophie would be prepared for whatever challenges came. As years passed, Continental Airways continued growing. The fleet expanded, new routes were added, and the company's reputation became a point of national pride. Emily spoke at business schools, testified before Congress on aviation policy, and served on boards dedicated to corporate ethics. She became a role model for anyone who believed companies could be forces for good. But Emily never forgot her youth's lessons. She remembered the humiliation of being dragged off that plane in Galveston, the betrayal of discovering her father's compromises. She used those memories to fuel her commitment to transparency and accountability. She instituted policies protecting whistleblowers, encouraging employees to speak up, and prioritizing passenger dignity above all else. When Continental Airways celebrated its 40th anniversary, the event was held at headquarters in Dallas. The atrium displayed vintage uniforms and photographs chronicling 4 decades of service. Emily stood on stage, looking at the faces of people who had built Continental, and felt deep gratitude. She spoke about the journey, the challenges and triumphs, the mistakes and lessons. She talked about her father, acknowledging his vision and flaws, and her responsibility to honor the best of what he created while building something better. She emphasized treating every person with dignity, remembering that behind every reservation was a human being with hopes and dreams. Emily's eyes found Daniel in the crowd, holding 10-year-old Sophie. Sophie waved, and Emily smiled. This was why she did it. Not for accolades, but to build something meaningful that would make the world better for her daughter, and all who followed. After celebrations ended, Emily stood alone in her office, at the window, watching planes take off and land in the fading evening light. Each carried hundreds of people with their own stories. Continental was part of all of it, a thread woven through countless lives. She thought about the little girl she had been, overwhelmed and uncertain. The teenager humiliated and dismissed who discovered her hero was flawed. The young woman who fought to prove herself, and the woman she had become, a leader who learned that strength meant being honest, facing mistakes and doing better. Her phone buzzed. A message from customer service forwarded a note from a passenger named Sarah, who flew Continental with her elderly mother. She wrote about flight attendants going out of their way to make her mother comfortable, treating her with kindness and respect. She thanked Continental for reminding her that companies still cared. She ended with a simple line that tightened Emily's throat. "You have built something truly special. Thank you for caring." Emily saved the message. These reminders mattered, showing why she did this work. It was not about profits or awards. It was about Sarah and her mother, about every passenger who trusted Continental. Standing in the quiet evening with runway lights stretching like a path into the future, Emily Harrison knew she had kept her promise. She had taken broken pieces of her father's dream and forged something new, something stronger, reflecting her own values. She had faced corruption and betrayal, weathered scandal and loss, and emerged transformed. Continental Airways was more than a company. It was proof that business could be a force for good, that success need not come at humanity's expense, that every journey mattered. As Emily watched planes taking flight, carrying people toward their dreams, she felt deep peace. She had honored her father by being true to herself. She had built a legacy of purpose, and she had given her daughter a model of leadership grounded in compassion, courage, and commitment to doing right. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky orange and gold. Emily watched one more plane lift off, wings catching the last light, and smiled. More challenges lay ahead, more difficult decisions, more doubt. But she was ready. She was Emily Harrison, a woman who had learned to give wings to millions of dreams, who transformed pain into purpose, and who proved that even the smallest voice could change the world.